Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. A supervising forensic specialist from California was asked by one of my patrons what he thought about the two investigators going in the house recently. Remember the footage that Brian Enton captured? And what he thought about them going in for 20 minutes with Kit and what that might be all about. What was that Kit and what was he looking for? This is someone who's got experience of a quadruple homicide crime scene, even one where 8 people were shot and killed. So I'm going to provide his response, his thoughts on this particular crime scene. Something else that's really interesting is we now have a photo proving that there was a canine unit on scene as early as November 14. That's one day after the incident. You can actually see a dog moving around the perimeter where that sort of chain link fence is. And that photo was taken by Derek Shook from Fox News. So one does wonder whether some sort of trail was found and where that trail led, if anywhere. It's also possible that if a trail was found, perhaps it led to a parking lot or a particular parking space. And that then led to this idea of a Hyundai Elantra. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. For those who have subscribed, welcome to the channel. There's also Patreon available, discussions going on there. That's at patreon.com/TCRS. If you're enjoying this content, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So in terms of this question around the investigators going to the scene, the footage that Brian Enton recorded, this was his response. He said, quote, "I can't quite tell exactly what that kit the investigators were carrying, but most likely it's a presumptive test kit. They will sample several areas that they think are blood, but not sure. So they'll swab it with a chemical. So in other words, certain areas where they think there could be blood, but maybe they're not sure. And so it's to confirm that certain areas are one kind of thing above another. And then they would use a chemical like, I think it's pronounced leucomalachite green. And so what happens is if the swab turns green, it's blood, not necessarily human blood, but most likely. And so they're going to be looking for that sort of thing taking place and then taking samples accordingly. He goes on to say also that it could be a digital scanner. They use it to digitally recreate the scene. But he says you need a tripod for that. But maybe the news just didn't show them bringing that in. The box is about that size for either one of those possibilities. Not sure why they would only be in the house for 20 minutes at a time, though. Now, my response to that is I doubt it was a digital scanner, firstly because they've already removed a significant amount of contents from inside the house, and secondly, because we definitely didn't see them carrying a tripod into the house. You literally see the investigators approach, go in, and then come out and go to their vehicle and leave. There's no tripod in that footage. So then he's provides his assessment on how this crime likely happened. So he says, those kids were probably drunk or high when they were killed. There's no way an alert person would watch their friends being stabbed. And if there were more than one assailant, there would have been evidence of that in the house as well. So this idea that there are multiple perpetrators, have the police sort of said that they're looking for one or more? I think it's kind of a difficult thing to answer. I don't know whether law enforcement have expressly said that they're only looking for one perpetrator. I believe they are. But anyway, they say if there is more than one person, they would have left evidence. Anyway, he goes on to say, most likely the guy killed one of them first, maybe even two. And I think what he means by that is there may have been a simultaneous slaying while the others were still asleep or trying to figure out what was going on. This is the crucial part. He says, by the time he or she got to the last victim, that victim was probably alert a little bit, and that's why they have defensive lines on their hands. Now, Cole Alteneder, this is my response to that. He lived on the second floor of 1122 King Road in 2021, the previous year. Alteneder thought the victims may have heard the killer's footsteps in what he described as the creaky old property. The thing with a house like that, 3 stories, people coming and going all the time, people sleeping over, and there being 5 residents anyway. So you one person in the house, and you would obviously occasionally incidentally hear one of the other 4 doing whatever, moving around, going to the bathroom, going to the kitchen. Is that they probably heard a lot of innocent scuffling around over a period of time and then just simply ignored it. Now, if you apply just that idea, it's interesting if you simply see the noise complaints for what they are. There's the sense of the kids themselves being deaf in a way to sounds, to the sounds they're making, to the sounds around them. It's all part of the fun, I guess. Ironically, the subtle sounds, the somewhat soft sounds of one after another being killed, those sort of perhaps muffled noises, thudding sounds, a footstep here or there, if they had been alert to those sounds, that could have saved at least 1 life, even 2, if they had listened and reacted to it. I imagine Ethan and Xana may have heard a thud or a knock, but bear in mind their room was on the one side of the house, whereas Maddie's room was upstairs on the other. And that I think maybe also something the killer was aware of. You could also have had sounds like a suppressed scream, so a sort of a muffled sound, which would have been created using a pillow over the face. We know they were killed in their beds. But it's almost certain that some of the victims did hear movement on the floor or on the stairs of the bed, sort of bumping around, perhaps against a wall, as the killer went from one bedroom up and down stairs to the next bedroom. Now, the reason why this looks like an inside job, in other words, from a student, someone who had been inside the house, is that one has a sense of familiarity from him with regards to the victim's habits, where, when, and how they slept. It suggests the killer encountered one or more of them earlier that night and knew they would be undermined and disoriented, or even that he didn't even need to see them directly because it was such a default setting. It was such a regular pattern, it was virtually a default setting. So really all of this is my analysis, just a couple of my observations. Another possibility is that he could confirm their status, and thus that he could commit the crime without a threat to himself, either by looking out a neighboring window and noting the time the various residents returned and in what state they were in, or perhaps he was sitting in a vehicle nearby observing the house. A third possibility is possibly that he was sent footage by someone just showing what state they were in or what they were doing. Now, going back to the CSI, he says, the proper knife, like a hunting knife with a hilt, would most likely be used if this was planned, and they did say it was a large knife. If you did it while the victims were asleep, then it doesn't have to be that frenzied. 2 or 3 to the chest and it's lights out. What he means by that is 2 or 3 plunges to the chest, which is essentially 1 or 2 seconds. 1 or 2 thrusts, puncture wounds to the chest, and that would be it. It would even be difficult to make a sound in that scenario. Now, I think this is the aspect that leads one to believe this someone has killed with stabbing weapons before. He knows where and how to do it and what to expect as well. Then going back to the CSI, he says, but for the one that was awake, that explains the defensive wounds and probably a lot of the erratic blood. So you would have more of erratic blood spatter in terms of a defensive wound because the victim would be, to some extent, moving about and probably also thrashing about. He says, from what I read, the forensic unit did some scans of the house, but that's no substitute for looking at the blood with your own eye. He goes on to say, in a stabbing case like this, the blood would have spoken volumes. You could have told who was stabbed first, second, third, and fourth, where the suspects were standing when they did it, and maybe even how much force was needed to do it. Although that last one needs some physics, and not all crime scene investigators are good at math. Now, my response to that is the chest, which is where all of the victims were apparently stabbed, is full of bones. Not just the sternum, that's the breastbone or the chest plate, but also ribs. The depth into the torso as well as the depth into bone would indicate force as well. And there might also be a learning curve as the perpetrator moved on to each new victim. He possibly used more force, he possibly targeted the major organs more effectively, or less, depending on how much each successive victim was able to respond as well. Okay, so when he was shown the blood coming out the side of the house, his response was, okay, so that's a lot. So what he seems to be thinking about here is that the only way you could get a wound like that is for a neck injury or throat injury. It's the only way you could have that volume of fluid. He says a knife through the heart actually doesn't create that much fluid at all. I've got to say I disagree with the CSI on this point. Firstly, the coroner, if I understood her correctly and if she spoke completely, seemed quite clear that all the victims had wounds to their chests. I think she was actually asked if there were neck wounds, and I think she said no. Secondly, you could be dealing with an accumulation of 2 victims' fluid, not just one. Thirdly, I think you could see a large volume of fluid based on at least 3 significant puncture wounds. I don't think it's just a single wound to the heart that is at issue here. Then the last thing he says is, forensically speaking, that case is a career maker for someone. The amount of frantic work necessary on that case is monumental. So he describes this crime scene in terms of the that sort of aspect of the evidence as monumental. He says, whatever team finishes, it will have experience that not a lot of people get, which means they would be sought after from other forensic units because of the work that they would have had to have done in a case like this, assuming they did it correctly. So my response is also that simply mapping this crime scene, which, as I say, the specialist describes as monumental, it's 2 floors, but essentially 3, and 4 victims, and just left a lot of evidence in terms of probably shoe prints and his movements, the movements of the victims. Then they're also roommates, and they're also the friends who came into the scene. There's also a dog in the story. I think it's one reason why this case is taking so long to process. You first got to process the evidence, and then you can make progress. Final point, as I mentioned, you can see confirmation that a canine unit was on scene, which is a sign that the cops were more on the ball, I think, in this case than perhaps they've been given credit. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.